Hello and very warm welcome to the Resilience Redefined podcast series. I'm Hamish Clark from PwC Middle East and delighted to be joined by my colleague Shireen Saka and introduce an awesome conversation with Professor Paul Dolan. Paul's a behavioural scientist and an award-winning author of the books Happiness Ever After and Happiness by Design. And in this episode, we dive into what it means to create an open and transparent culture and provide some practical tips for leaders in the world of business on happiness. Paul, fantastic to have you on.
I've read your book, Happiness by Design, and as a commercial person, I'm very struck by your concept of PPP, because for us, that means something very different around public-private partnerships. But for you, could you explain PPP and perhaps we get into the happiness conversation through that route?
Brilliant. Well, listen, thank you, Hamish. Yes, so pleasure-purpose principle, the idea that happiness is found in a twin set of experiences, things that we find fun and things that we find fulfilling. Of course, some things might be both and other things neither. But oftentimes, I guess working on a project at PwC, for example, might not be the most fun use of your time. I'm sure people can think of ways in which they might enjoy themselves in a hedonic sense more, but it might feel meaningful, purposeful and worthwhile. I just also do want to draw a distinction between experiences from evaluations and the stories that we tell about our happiness. And a lot of the ways in which we measure happiness, for example, in the large national surveys, we'll ask people questions like, overall, how satisfied are you with your life? So to say that these questions are not helpful, sometimes they are, but they're a different quality of question. They're asking people to reflect upon their lives and to say how happy they are, essentially when they're telling a story about the things that they think should or should not make them happy.
Oh, fantastic. I love that. Does happiness therefore require people to have a high degree of emotional intelligence to be able to be self-aware on whether they're not having enough pleasure or purpose in their life? And what if you don't have a high degree of emotional intelligence? Can you be happy?
You do need to be alert to some degree to whether and in what ways you might be using your time in ways that are either making you happy or actually oftentimes not as happy as you might otherwise be. And sometimes we get caught into habits and kind of by default, we end up doing things that we need to reflect upon at some point to see whether it is actually making us feel good or not. Because if we just go to that pleasure-purpose principle, I argue very strongly in the book and elsewhere, that if you're finding something neither pleasurable nor purposeful, you should probably ask yourself why you're doing it. Because, happiness and well-being are not fungible like money is, right? But happiness lost is happiness lost forever.
I also feel that there's a duty of care on us as an employer. We have to create the environment so people can enjoy their life.
Some of those interventions are actually really quick, simple, and very effective. Nobody actually likes wasting their time. I mean, even if you're being heavily compensated and remunerated for it, it's still pointless. And people will often quit jobs, for example, that are very well paid because they mispredict how much it will hurt. If you're working on a project and for some reason it might get changed or cancelled even, that's the salient time at which to step in and say, look, I understand that you've spent all this time and effort working on this. There will be opportunities for us to use some of what you've learned and what you've done on other projects. How long did it take me to say that? It took me like 20 seconds. When it's authentic and genuine, of course, then it has a massive effect, because a lot of times people just think, okay, well, that was a complete waste of time, and then they'll disappear off and feel really bad about it. So timely and salient feedback is something that any employer, even if they think they're doing it brilliantly, could probably do better.
You talk about the importance of designing our lives in order to be happier. Can you talk a little bit about that and why is that important?
Well, think about self-help books, right? So self-help books sell in their bucket load, and they sell in their bucket load because they don't work, right? Like, so the single biggest factor predicting whether you'll buy a self-help book is having already bought a self-help book. And what a self-help book will do is it will tell you things like be positive. It's like, yeah, I kind of worked that out, but how do I actually do that? How do I implement that into my daily routine and into my life? And you're left with very little guidance about how to do that. And so a whole raft of happiness gurus will tell you how to change your mind about how you see the world. And changing your mind is really difficult. And having the willpower to do that in certain ways is really difficult. Willpower is very, very weak. Whereas design power is really strong. We are making thousands of decisions every day. Most of those are done automatically, effortlessly, and actually, by and large, quite well. Our brain is constantly looking for associations in the environment to help make life easier. So if you want to change any behavior, the most effective way to do that is to change your environment, to design your life and your day in ways that make it easier for you to do things that will make you happy and harder for you to do things that will make you miserable. I do just want to say, just that actually does remind me of something else that I think will be important for your company and for certainly, Hamish, the work that you and your team are doing, is that we're going to spend most of this time quite naturally talking on the things that cause happiness and the ways in which you can design environments for example, to make yourself happier. One thing to be very, very cognizant of is what happiness causes, right? So causality in the direction from happiness to other things that we care about. But most of the things that you would want as an organization or for society come about when people are feeling better. They're more productive. They're more pro-social. They take less time off sick. So even if you don't care about happiness, I always say it's all soft and subjective and woolly. Even if you don't care about it as a final consequence, which of course I think is a mistake, but even if you don't, and you care about these other, arguably harder outcomes, like, the amount of money the company makes, productivity, and so on, then happiness is a really, really significant lever to pull to achieve some of those outcomes.
How open should we be to hearing when people aren't happy, and how do we create a culture whereby the sort of dialogue is a lot more open, we break through stigma, and people who, the face they give us, they might look happy but they're actually depressed, or they've got high anxiety levels and the sort of harder edge of the human psyche. How do we sort of add to those practical things with an environment or a culture that is a lot more open on this?
It's a very good question. And again, the answer is going to be a sort of boring one in the sense of finding balance, right? So you do want people, of course, and we're doing this much more in modern societies than we did previously in being open about, their mental health issues that they're having, for example, in a way that they weren't able to so readily or freely before. At the same time, of course, you don't want to create a culture that becomes a moaning culture because we know that misery loves company, right? I mean, and misery is much more contagious than happiness is. So a difficult challenge. It's not straightforward, but I think being alert to those twin concerns, I think, is important.
Fantastic. Your story, Paul, is you were heavy into health economics, and then you attended this conference, which is like a game changer for you. And you've been quite sort of practical around your observations as well. So is that a sort of another sort of practical tip for us as a business, if we put us from the employer side, not the staff, is that we are keeping things very practical. Our leaders get into this, apply it, talk about it. Is that what you would encourage as well? So we're leading by example?
Yeah, I think so. So when I was in the Cabinet Office in Number 10, we wrote a report for the Cabinet Office that was then turned into a peer-reviewed publication called Mindspace. The first element of Mindspace, it's a 9-letter mnemonic, a 9-letter checklist, is M, and it's messenger. And I think it's what you just drew attention to in your question, is that there's very clear evidence on this now, that we listen to people who have the following combination of characteristics. Ideally, they have authority and expertise, right? So you're not going to listen to someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. You trust them, and ideally, a third dimension is similarity. Someone like you, right? So what you want is messengers that are almost walking the walk as well as talking the talk. When you're thinking about implementing some of these interventions in PwC, think about whether you can find that sweet spot of expertise, trust, and similarity.
In your book, you debunk a few myths, like you've got to be very careful about thinking that if someone doesn't have children that they might not be happy, or if you're extrovert, you're naturally happy. And just talk us a bit about guiding us about how we should help people and not walk into stereotypes around wellness.
The story is of my wife's best friend who we went for dinner with, and she was working at Media Land, shall we call it. And we went for dinner, and she variously complained about every aspect of her job while we were at dinner for literally the whole 2 hours that she was with us. Her boss, her colleagues' commute. Everything about her daily experiences was awful. And then we were leaving dinner and she stood up and without any irony said, do you know, I really love working at Media Land. And I think therein lies the distinction between evaluations and experiences, that her experiences were miserable, but Media Land was somewhere where she'd always wanted to work. Her parents were proud, her friends were jealous. When she thought about whether it ought to make her happy, it was a great place to work. But sometimes we can get carried away with these narratives from our parents, from our friends, from social expectations, from evolutionary advantage, can come from a whole range of sources that sometimes are not consistent or congruent with us leading the lives that will make us happier ourselves.
Thank you, Paul. So I think from that, maybe if we can go a little bit into your podcast and where you go through the duck rabbit analogy. And I think a lot of that applies to us here within PwC. It's a very diverse environment, and you have people from so many different backgrounds, so many different working styles. And we know that we tend to gravitate towards the perceptions that we're comfortable with and the people who confirm to our own perceptions. But how do we find ways to work in a converging environment like PwC and make sure that we override some of these biases that we have?
You know that the human brain takes till about 25 to fully develop, right? And the last bit of that is the perspective taking piece. So it's like, it's entirely, we've actually got we've got one teenage daughter and almost teenage son, like they're 13 and 12, our kids. And so it's entirely natural that they don't understand how someone can see the world in any way other than through their own eyes. But at the same time, anyone who's had children, of course, it's about kids, but will always say if they've had 2 kids, how different their kids are. Like every parent says it about their children. So from immediately that you've got people that see the world differently. And our kids do. They literally the lens through which they look at the world is very different. So we should be alert to that. We see it in lots of people around us, in our friends. Well-functioning societies have a diversity of perspective across a whole range of attributes, right? I mean, just take risk-taking, which is an obvious one for you to think about. We would never have evolved in the way that we have done if everyone was cautious or everyone took loads of risks. You need some people to take risks and other people to be cautious. Well-functioning societies have a diversity of attributes across pretty much any attribute that you can think of. So why is it that we're so reluctant to accept that and understand that when we are, for example, thinking about the people that we want to associate with, or people we like and people we don't like? And it was the motivation for the Duck Rabbit podcast, was to think about ways in which we can break down some of these polarized positions that we adopt. It's, all of us, no matter how much we might say that we like disagreement, it's just a lot easier if people are nodding their heads and shaking. It's actually more transactionally efficient as well, right? So if you can make assumptions about what someone else is thinking, you don't have to go through the process of truly understanding it. But we naturally gravitate to people who are like us in a whole range of dimensions. And so the ability to be able to understand someone else's perspective, to truly put ourselves in the eyes or shoes or whatever, somebody else is really, really significant. And again, that's not going to come from me making the effort to do it using willpower, to keep constantly reminding myself that I need to listen to different perspectives. It's going to come from the environment being decided in ways that make it easier for me to do that put me in meetings or group settings or whatever I might organize it, with people that do disagree. Maybe you might set a red team challenge. Maybe you've got something explicitly designed into your work practices that make dissent and disagreement and discussion more likely to be listened to, because we're not going to do it naturally for ourselves. At the same time, we need to ensure that with that comes diversity of perspective, actively encouraging those kinds of discussions and disagreements, and reminding ourselves, we say there's this saying that don't take my kindness as a sign of weakness. Don't take my willingness to listen to your different perspective as a sign that I don't believe what I hold to be true.
No, and I think that resonates really well. Thank you for sharing that. What are your top practical tips for someone to adopt in their lives and hopefully lead a happy life?
There was a book in the 80s, a famous book titled, I think it was in the 80s, called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. Completely wrong. It's absolutely completely wrong. Life is lived in the small stuff. We might have the big stuff that is, the move across the world, but actually day to day, we're experiencing life as a series of experiences, of activities that we engage in, of the people that we pay attention to and the things that we do. It's in the small stuff. And I can make a pretty confident claim, whilst I've talked a lot about, well, a little bit about how people differ, like for example, the things that they might find pleasurable or purposeful, or the balance between them. I would never prescribe very much, but I would make the following prescriptions I would be, it's not even quietly confident, pretty certain that if you did a little bit more of each of these things every day, you would be happier, irrespective of where your baseline is right now. Listening to music. The brain just literally lights up. There's very many studies that shows most activation comes from listening to music. Go outdoors. Biophilia is what it's called. It's actually just being around nature, around fresh air, around greenery. Spend time with people that you enjoy being with. Help other people. That is a really, really selfish thing to do. It's, of course, selfless because it benefits the other person, but you get an enormous amount of benefit from that, both hedonic and eudaimonic, that comes from helping other people. Laughter, really, really underestimated, undervalued. There's something actively good about it. Physiologically, we're healthier when we can laugh. And then the final thing of the 6 is new experiences. Having new experiences. The worst that can happen is that you don't like it and you don't do it again. And the best is that you found something new to enjoy. So there's a half a dozen things there that are, the evidence, the research evidence is pretty clear about the cause and effects, not just the correlations, but the cause and effects of all of those dimensions on improving lives. And you can, as I say, you can think about how some of those can be more readily and easily applied in the workplace that will make people happier in the workplace, more likely that you retain the staff that you want to, less likely that they'll leave, and also make them more productive, pro-social and healthier as a result.
Thank you, Paul, for those practical tips. It's a brilliant way to finish the conversation. I really appreciate the discussion and wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you.